The knock came at 7:15 on a Thursday evening, and Jonah Beaumont Tremblay almost didn't answer it. He was standing at the kitchen counter, reheating leftover chicken soup, one hand on the pot, the other holding a permission slip that Caitlin needed signed by Friday. The dog was barking at the back door. The radiator was making that sound again, the low, grinding hiss that he'd been meaning to call someone about since October. He had 17 things happening at once, the way he always did between 5 and 8 on weeknights, and whoever was at the front door was the 18th. He set the spoon down, called out to Caitlin to stop jumping on the bed. He could hear it from the kitchen, that rhythmic thud, and walked to the front of the house, wiping his hands on the dish towel tucked into his belt loop. He opened the door. The woman standing on his porch was not someone he recognized. Not at first. She was wearing a gray wool coat, belted at the waist, and she was holding a manila envelope against her chest like it was something she wasn't sure she wanted to give him. Her hair was pulled back. She looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days. She also looked like she'd spent $500 making sure no one could tell. Not Jonah, his full name. Jonah Tremblay. The Beaumont part she didn't use because she'd known him before he added it. Marguerite, he said. The name came out strange in his mouth, like a word in a language he used to speak. Marguerite Delacroix Okafor stood on his porch in the November cold and didn't quite look at him the way someone looks at a person they've come to see. She looked at him the way someone looks at a place they've been trying to find for a long time. "I know this is," she started. "You should come inside," he said. "It's -12. Here's what you need to understand about Jonah before any of this makes sense. He was 41 years old and he lived in a semi-detached house in Hamilton, Ontario, that needed a new roof and had a backyard just large enough for a swing set and a garden he'd mostly kept alive through stubbornness and YouTube tutorials. He taught history at an East End secondary school, grade 10 and 11, and he was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of teacher students came back to visit years later. He coached the junior boys basketball team on Wednesday afternoons and drove Caitlin to swimming lessons on Saturdays and made soup from scratch because it was cheaper and because his daughter liked to help peel the carrots. Caitlin was 7. She had her mother's gap in her front teeth and Jonah's eyebrows and a laugh that could startle birds off a wire. He had been raising her alone for 6 years. Not because her mother died, because her mother left, which in certain ways is harder to explain to a 7-year-old, and in other ways is not hard at all, because children are more pragmatic than people give them credit for. What Caitlin knew was that her mother lived far away and called sometimes, and her dad lived here and was always here, and that was the shape of things. Jonah had worked very hard to make that shape feel solid and not like something missing, and for the most part he had succeeded. What he had not told Caitlin, what he had not told most people, was that before her mother, before the marriage that didn't last, before everything that came after, there was Marguerite. There are stories that seem finished and aren't. You seal them up, you put them somewhere. Life keeps going and you get good at not opening that drawer. And then one Thursday in November, someone knocks on your door and the drawer opens on its own. Marguerite Delacroix Okafor was 43 and she ran a company that provided logistics consulting to mid-sized manufacturers across southern Ontario and Quebec. She had 42 employees, an office in downtown Toronto, and a reputation in her industry for being precise, efficient, and occasionally terrifying. She had built all of it from nothing, from a one-bedroom apartment and a laptop and a client list of 3 people. And she had done it during a decade that had also included a marriage, a high-conflict divorce, and the sale of a house she'd loved for reasons she couldn't fully explain and tried not to examine too closely. She was successful. She was, by any reasonable metric, fine. She sat at Jonah's kitchen table now, still in her coat, and looked at the pot of chicken soup on the stove and the permission slip on the counter and the crayons drawings held to the fridge with magnets shaped like maple leaves. She looked at the life he had assembled inside this house, piece by piece, and she felt something she hadn't been prepared for. She felt like she recognized it. "How old is she?" Marguerite asked. "7," Jonah said. He set a mug of tea in front of her. He hadn't asked if she wanted it. He just made it the way he used to. "Her name is Caitlin." Marguerite wrapped her hands around the mug. "She sounds like she's doing parkour upstairs. She does that. I don't fight it anymore." He sat down across from her. "Marguerite, why are you here?" She put the envelope on the table between them. He didn't touch it. "My father died," she said, 3 months ago. Jonah looked at her. "I'm sorry, don't be." She stopped. Looked at the tea. He was complicated. "You know that. You knew that." He had. He'd known Edouard Delacroix for exactly 8 months. during which time the man had been cordial and measured and said all the right things and worked with practiced surgical patience to ensure that his daughter and Jonah Tremblay went their separate ways. Jonah hadn't understood it fully at the time. He'd been 26 and in love and had assumed the problem was him, that he wasn't enough, that he'd been weighed and found lacking in ways he couldn't quite name. It had taken him years to stop believing that. "He left me a letter," Marguerite said. "In the estate, along with everything else." She nodded at the envelope. "He also left you one." The kitchen was very quiet. Upstairs, the jumping had stopped. Somewhere the dog had given up on the back door and settled. "He left me a letter," Jonah repeated. "He wrote it 2 years ago, when he got the diagnosis." She finally looked at him directly, and he saw how tired she was, not sleep-tired, but the other kind, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time and not knowing where to put it down. "In mine, he told me everything. What he did, why he did it." A pause. "What he told you that wasn't true." Jonah went very still. "Let's go back, because this part matters. 12 years ago, before Caitlin, before the marriage to someone else, before all the ordinary architecture of 2 lives that had separated and rebuilt. Jonah and Marguerite had been together for 2 years. They had met at a conference in Ottawa, which sounds unlikely but isn't, because conferences are full of people paying attention to the wrong things. And occasionally 2 of them find each other by accident. She had been presenting her first major consulting project. He had been there accompanying a colleague from the school board and had sat in the wrong session by mistake. He stayed for the whole presentation. They were together for 2 years after that. Long distance at first, she was in Toronto, he was in Hamilton, and then just together the way people are when they stop keeping track of whose city it is. He had met her father 4 times, and each meeting had been pleasant in a careful architectural way, the kind of pleasant that has load-bearing walls. And then one evening, Jonah got a phone call. Edouard Delacroix called him directly, man to man, the way men of his generation sometimes did when they wanted to bypass the woman in the equation entirely. He told Jonah in clear and reasonable language that Marguerite had confided in him, that she cared for Jonah, yes, but she was struggling, that the relationship had begun to feel like an obligation, that she didn't know how to end it without hurting him, and it was tearing her apart. "She's not good at disappointing people," Edouard had said. "It's a weakness she's had since she was small. I'm asking you, man to man, to make it easier for her. To step back." Jonah had believed him. He hadn't asked Marguerite. He hadn't called her, hadn't pushed, hadn't demanded an explanation. He had believed her father because the story fit the shape of his deepest fear, that he was a burden, that he was loved out of habit rather than want, and he had stepped back. He had sent her a message, careful and dignified, about needing space, about growing in different directions. She had called twice. He hadn't answered, and that was that. He had never told anyone this, not the full version. He had filed it under things that didn't work out and built his life on top of it. "He told you I wanted out," Marguerite said, not a question. "Yes, and you believed him." It was the kind of statement that could have been an accusation but wasn't. She was too tired for accusation. "I was 29, Jonah said, and the story he told me was one I'd already half told myself." He looked at the envelope on the table. What did he say in your letter?" He said he panicked. She turned the mug in her hands. "He said he liked you. He wanted me to know that. He said you were decent and he knew it. But I was building the company then. It was barely 18 months old, and he was scared. He had this idea of what my life should look like, what I should marry, what I should build my future beside." A short exhale that wasn't quite a laugh. "He thought I was too young to know what I wanted and too stubborn to listen to advice, so he took it out of my hands by lying to me, by lying to you." They sat with that. Upstairs, Caitlin had opened her bedroom door. Jonah could tell because the sound of the house changed. The small, distant voice of her singing to herself, the creak of the hallway floor. In a few minutes, she'd come down looking for a snack or wanting to show him something she'd made. She did that. She was a kid who still wanted to show him things, and he was acutely aware that this would not last forever, so he paid attention every time. "I'm not here to." Marguerite started. "I don't want you to think I came here expecting something. I found the letter in October. I spent a month deciding whether to find you." She paused. "I came because he stole something from you without your consent, and the letter he left for you is yours, whatever you want to do with it. But I also came because—" She stopped again. "Because?" Jonah said. "Because he told me what he did, and I sat in that lawyer's office, and I thought, Jonah doesn't know. He spent 12 years not knowing, and that felt." She looked at the maple leaf magnets on the fridge, at the small ordinary evidence of a life. "That felt like something I couldn't let stand." Here is the question no one asks out loud in these moments, but everyone is thinking. What if the thing that was taken had led, circuitously and painfully, to something you wouldn't trade? Jonah thought about this in the silence after Marguerite spoke. He thought about the marriage that hadn't lasted and the daughter who had. He thought about the house and the soup and the swing set and the coaching and the permission slip. He thought about a Saturday morning, 2 winters ago, when Caitlin had crawled into his bed at 6 a.m. and fallen back asleep with her hand curled in his, and he had lain there in the dark with the kind of fullness that has no name in any language he'd studied. He would not undo any of it. He couldn't. But that's not the same as saying the theft didn't happen. Caitlin came downstairs at 7:30. She stopped in the kitchen doorway, looked at the stranger at the table, and turned to her father with the frank assessment that 7-year-olds are permitted and adults are not. "Who's that?" she said. "Her name is Marguerite," Jonah said. "She's an old friend of mine, from a long time ago." Caitlin considered this. "Do you want a cookie?" she said to Marguerite. "We have the ones with the chocolate in the middle. Dad makes them, but he says they're too sweet, and then he eats 5 of them." Marguerite, for the first time, smiled. It was the kind of smile that rearranges a face. "I would love a cookie," she said. Caitlin disappeared to find them, and in the moment she was gone. Jonah looked at Marguerite across the table, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything. Because there are moments when the weight of 12 years sits in a room with you so completely that speech would be beside the point. "You don't have to read it tonight," Marguerite said. "Or at all. That's yours to decide. I know, I'm not staying." She straightened, reached for her coat buttons. "I found you, I brought what he left you, I said what I came to say. The rest is," she gestured vaguely, at the house, at the space between them that had 12 years folded up inside it. "The rest is yours." Caitlin reappeared with a plate of cookies and set them between the 2 adults with the solemn gravity of someone presiding over a peace negotiation. "Dad says you have to have milk with cookies," she announced. "It's a rule." "Is it a hard rule?" Marguerite said, "or more of a guideline?" Caitlin thought about this very seriously. "It's in between," she said finally. And Jonah laughed, a real one, surprised out of him, and watched his daughter climb up onto the chair beside the stranger at the table and begin explaining the difference between hard rules and guidelines with the authority of someone who had spent considerable time negotiating both. Marguerite left at 9. Jonah stood at the door and watched the taillights of her rental car disappear down the street, and then he stood there a little longer in the cold, one hand on the doorframe. The envelope was on the counter inside. He'd read it later. Not tonight. Tonight he had a daughter to put to bed and a soup to finish and a permission slip to sign. But later, in the quiet after the house settled, he would sit at the kitchen table and open the letter from a man who had been afraid of the wrong things for the wrong reasons. And he would read every word. And here's what he already knew, standing in the cold in the open doorway. The letter would not change what had been taken. It would not give him back the years. It would not explain them away or make the shape of his life feel other than it was. But there was something different about knowing, about having the theft named out loud by the person who came back to name it. For 12 years he had believed, somewhere deep and foundational, that he had been let go because he wasn't quite enough, that Marguerite had needed her father to speak for her because she couldn't bear to tell Jonah herself. He had built a life on top of that belief the way you build on ground you haven't fully tested, carefully, with extra supports, never quite trusting the foundation. Now he knew the ground was different than he'd thought. That didn't fix everything. It didn't fix anything, really. But there is something to be said for standing on true ground, even when you've already built your house. He read it after Caitlin fell asleep. It was 3 pages, handwritten, in the cramped, precise script of an engineer. Edouard Delacroix had been many things, but sloppy was not among them. The letter was direct. It did not ask for forgiveness. It said, "I told you a lie. I told you my daughter was done with you, and she was not. I did this because I was afraid. I was afraid of what your life looked like and what it would require of her, and I thought I knew better than she did. I have spent 12 years finding out that I didn't. It said, you were a good man. She would have been lucky. I was not big enough at the time to let that matter more than my fear." 3 pages. Then, "I am sorry, Jonah. I know that's not enough. I'm giving it to you anyway." He folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Then he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house and let himself feel the shape of it. Not the anger. The anger had been and gone in waves all evening, manageable, familiar from years of practice. But the other thing underneath it, the grief that was never about Ed at all. He'd loved her. He'd loved her, and he'd been made to believe she didn't want him. and he'd spent 12 years not letting himself think about that in full. And now it was 4 in the morning and there was nowhere to put it. But here, at this table, in this kitchen, in this life he had built that he also meant and didn't regret. Both things at once. That's the thing no one tells you. It doesn't get sorted out into before and after. You hold both. He texted her on a Tuesday. He'd found her through the company website, which felt strange, but the alternative was social media, and that felt stranger. He sent a professional email to the company address that simply said he'd like to meet if she was open to it. She responded in 20 minutes with her personal number and the words "I hoped you would." They met at a cafe in Hamilton. Her choice, she said, because she'd come to him last time and that seemed only fair. He arrived first. He got a table by the window and ordered a coffee and looked at the street outside and thought, I don't know what this is. I don't know what it will be. I'm 41 and I have a daughter and a house and a job and a dog and 17 things happening at once on any given evening, and I don't know anything for certain. Which was true. And also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that when Marguerite walked in out of the November cold, 3 weeks later now, hat on, a red scarf he didn't recognize, looking around the cafe until she found him, he felt something that he recognized from 12 years ago and had not expected to feel again. Not certainty, not yet, but the particular alertness of a life paying attention. She sat down. She took off her scarf. She looked at him across the table in the cafe with the winter light coming sideways through the glass, and she said, I don't know how to do this part. Neither do I, he said. I figured. She picked up the menu she didn't need. I thought maybe that could be okay, starting from not knowing. Starting from not knowing, she said, and going from there. Here is what happened eventually. Slowly and with many wrong turns and several awkward silences and at least 2 conversations that required a walk around the block afterwards to process, they went from there. Not fast. Nothing between them had ever been fast. They were both in their 40s, which meant they had the inconvenient habit of thinking before speaking, and the even more inconvenient habit of knowing what they didn't want. What they did want took longer to say out loud, but it got said. Caitlin, for her part, had opinions. She was 8 by the time Marguerite started coming to dinner on Fridays with any regularity, and 8-year-olds are less sentimental about the past, and more pragmatic about the present than anyone over 30 gives them credit for. What Caitlin assessed was, this woman is interesting, she explains things directly, she likes hockey more than Dad, and she makes him laugh in a specific way he doesn't laugh at other things. These, for Caitlin, were the relevant criteria. I like her, she told Jonah one evening, with the matter-of-fact authority she'd inherited from both sides of whatever she was made of. She's not trying to be my mom. She's just being herself. Jonah thought this was one of the more astute things anyone had said to him in recent memory. Yeah, he said, she is. There is a moment, ask anyone who has walked back through a door they thought was closed, when the story stops being about what was lost and starts being about what's here. It's not a dramatic moment, no thunder, no violins, no sudden certainty that erases the years. It's quiet. It's a Tuesday evening or a Friday dinner or a Saturday morning. It's the specific ordinary texture of another person becoming part of the furniture of your life, not filling a gap but adding something new. Jonah recognized it on a February afternoon when Marguerite and Caitlin were sitting at the kitchen table, the table where none of this had started, doing a puzzle together, and the dog was underfoot, and he was making soup again, and the radiator was making its grinding hiss again, and the ordinary machinery of his life was running at full volume, and Marguerite was there in the middle of it, not as a visitor and not as a memory, but just there. He didn't say anything about it. He stirred the soup and kept his back to the table and let the moment be what it was. But he thought, this is what was meant to happen to the ground. It was always going to need testing. People sometimes ask, well, they don't ask Jonah directly because Canadians are too polite for that. But he can see them wanting to, whether he forgave Edouard Delacroix. The honest answer is that he spent a long time thinking forgiveness was a door you either opened or kept closed. A binary thing. Yes or no. He has come to believe it's more like weather. Some mornings he wakes up and the loss of 12 years sits on his chest like a cold season. He thinks about the version of himself that might have existed, less defended maybe, with a different kind of trust in his own adequacy. He thinks about the 2 years he and Marguerite had and the 10 after that where they didn't. And there is a specific grief in that arithmetic that he does not think will ever fully dissolve. But the man who wrote 3 pages and signed his name to them and knew when he did it that he'd get no credit for it, because he wrote those letters 2 years before he died, which means he wrote them without any expectation of absolution. That man was also someone who had spent a long time being unable to say a true thing and chose at the end to say it. Jonah doesn't call that forgivable exactly, but he calls it human. What he knows is this: there are two kinds of debts, the kind that can be repaid and the kind that can't. Edouard Delacroix owed him a truth, and he paid it the only way he had left, in paper and ink and silence, from the other side of a thing he couldn't come back from. It was not enough. It was also not nothing. Jonah keeps the letter in the drawer of the desk in the spare room, the one that now has a whiteboard on the wall and Marguerite's second laptop charger on the table when she works from here. He doesn't read it often. Maybe once a year. He reads it the way you look at a scar, not with pleasure, but with the acknowledgement that what it marks was real and that you made it through. This is a story about what gets taken and what gets found and what gets built in the space between. It doesn't have a clean ending, because real things rarely do. But on a Friday evening in late spring, with Caitlin setting the table and the dog finally at peace with the back door situation and the radiator quiet for once, and Marguerite's voice from the hallway asking whether they had any of that bread left from the market. On that evening, in the ordinary, unremarkable light of an ordinary, unremarkable life, Jonah Beaumont Tremblay was standing in his own kitchen, and the door was open, and he knew exactly where he was. That was enough. That had always been the thing. Not certainty, and not the past made right, and not the years given back, but the door open, the light on, the people he loved in the next room. That was where the story had always been headed. He just hadn't known it would take this long to arrive.